Hi and welcome. My name is Liz Ndoye, and we are doing the next in the series of Art at Home lessons sponsored by the Hoboken Public Library. In August, we have been doing lessons that are based on the theme of summer vacation, and tonight I want to talk about an artist who spent a lot of time in national parks and who loved nature and in fact was a member of the Sierra Club from the age of 17 throughout his entire life. We're going to talk about his work. His name is Ansel Adams, and then I'm going to show you a project, an art activity that you can do in your own home about nature and celebrating the wonder of parks in the United States. So the artist we're going to focus on tonight is one of my favorites, the photographer Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams was born in 1902 in San Francisco, California, and died in 1984. He was a brilliant photographer, although he did not start out as a photographer. In fact, he wanted to be a concert pianist. One of his neighbors, when he was a young child, was a piano player, and he loved the sound of the piano so much that that became his ambition, his early ambition. One of his earliest memories is of the fire in San Francisco when he was only 4 years old, and that left an indelible image, visual image on Adams' brain and mind that he retained throughout his whole life. And the image of the smoke rising against the cityscape really helped to form the aesthetics that he had later in life. He spent a great deal of time in nature. He loved nature from a young age. He spent a lot of time in his very young years on the shoreline in San Francisco, where he spent a lot of time observing nature and wildlife. So now we're going to look at some of pictures that he created. He was a black and white photographer early on in his career. He hand-colored photographs, but decided he did not like how that looked, and he stopped doing that and only did black and white photography. Adams spent a great deal of time in Yosemite. The first time he went was with his family. And while there, he met a landscape painter, Harry Best, who kept a studio home in Yosemite and lived there during the summers. Best allowed Adams to practice on his old square piano, and Adams grew interested in Best's daughter Virginia and later married her. On her father's death in 1936, Virginia inherited the studio and continued to operate it until 1971. The studio is now known as the Ansel Adams Gallery and remains owned by the Adams family. Adams first visited Yosemite National Park in 1916 with his family. He wrote of his first view of the valley. The splendor of Yosemite burst upon us, and it was glorious. One wonder after another descended upon us. There was light everywhere. A new era began for me. His father gave him his first camera during that stay, an Eastman Kodak Brownie box camera, and he took his first photographs with his usual hyperactive enthusiasm. He returned to Yosemite on his own the next year with better cameras and a tripod. During the winters of 1917 and 18, he learned basic darkroom technique while working part-time for a San Francisco photograph finisher. Adams' first photographs were published in 1921, and Best Studio began selling his Yosemite prints the next year. His early photos already showed careful composition and sensitivity to tonal balance. In letters and cards to family, he wrote of having dared to climb to the best viewpoints and to brave the worst elements. During the mid-1920s, the fashion in photography was pictorialism, which strove to imitate paintings with soft focus, diffuse light, and other techniques. Adams experimented with such techniques as well as the bromoil process, which involved brushing an oily ink onto the paper. Adams used a soft focus lens, capturing a glowing luminosity that captured the mood of a magical summer afternoon. But by 1925, he had rejected pictorialism altogether for a more realistic approach that relied on sharp focus, heightened contrast, precise exposure, and darkroom craftsmanship. You can see examples of that craftsmanship in this photograph. The exquisite detail in the bark of the tree trunk up close, and then the fact that you can almost see every leaf in the tree behind. The beautiful quality of the foggy atmospheric effect in the back. So Adams liked to use a very small aperture and long exposures in his work because this helped to create the detail, the focus, and the wonderful contrast between dark and light. And that's what I want you to focus on when we look at the next few photographs. The extraordinary difference between the very, very bright whites he has in some places and the very dark contrast in others. Between 1929 and 1942, Adams' work matured and he became more established. The 1930s were a particularly experimental and productive time for him. He expanded the technical range of his works, emphasizing detailed close-ups as well as large forms from mountains to factories. He began visiting Taos, New Mexico, where he met and made friends with the poet Robinson Jeffers, artist John Marin, and Georgia O'Keeffe, and probably the biggest mentor and influence in his professional career, the photographer Paul Strand. He was very popular with his artist friends. He had a talkative, high-spirited nature, and this combined with his excellent piano playing made him the highlight of every party. Strand was especially influential. Adams was impressed by the simplicity and detail of Strand's negatives, which showed a style that ran counter to the soft-focus, impressionistic pictorialism still popular at the time. Strand shared secrets of his technique with Adams and convinced him to pursue photography fully. One of Strand's suggestions that Adams adopted was to use glossy paper to intensify tonal values. Adams put on his first solo exhibition, pictorial photographs of the Sierra Nevada mountains, at the Smithsonian Institution in 1931. It featured 60 prints taken in the High Sierra and the Canadian Rockies. He received a favorable review from the Washington Post, which said, "His photographs are like portraits of the giant peaks, which seem to be inhabited by mythical gods." His career really began to take off. And look at this magnificent photograph. The way he's created such a dynamic composition by not trying to capture the whole tree, but the tall, straight light verticals of the bottom of these giant tree trunks against the very rich darks behind them. It's just an extraordinary photograph. The small aperture again enabled him to see and show tiny details in the foreground that really make this photograph so interesting to look at. You can see almost every crack in the bark of the tree trunks. Later in his career, Adams formed a group of photographic artists with Edward Weston and the great photographer Imogen Cunningham. They did marvelous exhibitions together. This is the final photograph of Adams that we're going to look at before we begin our project for tonight. And again, I want you to pay close attention to the really amazing bright whites and then the darker blacks and grays. It's this contrast that makes his photographs so exquisite. The capturing of the details in the rock face of this mountain, and then that in contrast with the white lacy clouds in the sky behind. So our art experience today is to create a landscape in only black, white, and shades of gray, trying to recreate the magnificent darks and lights that we saw in Adams' photographs. All I'm using for this painting today is black acrylic paint and white acrylic paint. This is paint that I got at Michael's, so you can go to their stores in person and buy it. It's really cheap, or you can buy it online. But just black and white tonight. And I'm going to recommend that you start by doing an exercise. This is what artists do in order to feel a little bit more control of their color mixing and their color mixing techniques. So I'm going to recommend that the first step in working on this painting tonight is to create this gray scale. What I did first was, with a pencil, just draw a long oblong that I then divided into smaller rectangles. And very simply, I started with pure white in the first box, adding a little bit of black for each box thereafter. And you can see my grays are getting darker as I go. You don't have to make a gray scale that looks exactly like mine. You won't be able to replicate how much black I used in each rectangle. But when you do your own, you're going to gain an understanding of how much or how little black and white you want to use in order to create the grays that you need. So here I am now at the end of my scale, where it's going to be predominantly black, and at the end it's going to be pure black with as little white as possible. Of course, if I'd washed my brush, I would have achieved that. But I recommend doing this first. It's really a lot of fun, easy to do, and it will help you understand how to mix the shades of gray that you need to accomplish the painting we're going to do tonight. This is a painting that I started earlier. I was looking at an Ansel Adams photograph of the Sierra Nevada mountains. I drew the outline of the shapes of the cliffs first in pencil. Then I went over it with black Sharpie. And then I proceeded to paint in different tones of gray, different shades of gray, a very washy laying out of my composition. So at this point, there's very little detail. I allowed the washes of paint to dry, and now I'm ready to go back in and start creating detail. I only use black and white paint. I used rather large brushes for doing this because, again, I was not interested in detail. I just wanted to figure out my composition and where the darks and lights would go. So I'm going to define, these are trees here in the foreground. They are bare trees with no foliage. I'm going to go over them with more black to define their shape. Give them a few more branches. You may think that it's limiting to only use black and white, but I guarantee you're going to enjoy it because you can create a highly dramatic composition by limiting your palette in this way. You can find photographs by Adams online. You can look for photographs that you yourself might have taken on trips to national parks. Either way, I think it's helpful if you work from a photograph or a picture and not try and do this from your imagination. So the trees are emerging. There were a few really tiny ones back here by the horizon. I'm going to add them now with less detail because the further you go back in space, the less detail you will see. Now I'm going to work on the white highlights. It's important to let the first layer of paint dry so that you can go back in for the detail work. In the foreground of this painting, there was a lot of brush and grasses, and I'm putting that in now. They were quite light in value compared to the dark trees around them. right, and now I'm going to start defining those mountain tops. Put in a little bit more brush here on the horizon. Now I'm going to work with my darker grays. To show the edges of the mountains. You can also have a lot of fun with texture with the black and white image. Let the brush strokes show. Obviously it's a cliff. You want to have a rough surface. Keep going back in as the paint dries and add more detail. And have fun. As you work, keep walking back and look at your painting from a distance. It will help you to decide what to add, what to eliminate. It's very difficult to stay close to what you're working on and be able to see the entire composition. So it's helpful to keep stepping back to see what needs to be added. So this is a great beginning, and I think you can get a sense of what we're trying to accomplish with this art activity. I hope you try it at home, and I hope that you visit the Hoboken Library website at hobokenlibrary.org in order to see all the lessons that we have created for art at home. Before I leave, I realized I forgot to explain why I'm wearing a mask. We are still in the middle of our COVID-19 stay at home pandemic. and my cinematographer. So once again, please visit the HobokenLibrary.org website. Much thanks to the Hoboken Public Library for letting us continue to have our art at home classes. Enjoy working with the grayscale. Learn to love working in black and white, the lusciousness of both black and white. They are two of my favorite colors to work with. Art on. Enjoy yourselves. Until next week.